Deathworld by Harry Harrison, read by Gerald Frost. Chapter 15. The truck rumbled up to the perimeter gate and stopped. Crannon waved to the guards through the front window, then closed a metal shield over it. When the gates swung open, the truck, really a giant armored tank, ground slowly forward. There was a second gate beyond the first that did not open until the interior one was closed. Jason looked through the second driver's periscope as the outer gate lifted. Automatic flamethrowers flared through the opening, cutting off only when the truck reached them. A scorched area ringed the gate. Beyond that, the jungle began. Unconsciously, Jason shrank back in his seat. All the plants and animals he had seen only specimens of existed here in profusion. Thorn-ringed branches and vines laced themselves into a solid mat, through which the wildlife swarmed. A fury of sound hurled at them. Thuds and scratches rang through the armor. Crannon laughed and closed the switch that electrified the outer grid. The scratchings died away as the beast completed the circuit and grounded themselves to the hull. It was slow-speed, low-gear work tearing through the jungle. Crannon had his face buried in the periscope mask and silently fought the controls. With each mile, the going seemed to get better, until finally he swung up the periscope and opened the window armor. The jungle was still thick and deadly, but nothing like the area immediately around the perimeter. It appeared that most of the lethal power of Piraeus were concentrated in the significant single area around the settlement. Why, Jason asked himself, why this immense planetary hatred? The motors died, and Crannon stood up, stretching and swearing. "We're here. Let's unload." There was bare rock around the truck, a rounded hillock that projected from the jungle, too smooth and steep for vegetation to get a hold on. Crannon opened the cargo hatches, and they pushed out the boxes and crates. When they finished, Jason slumped down, exhausted, onto the pile. "Get back in. We're leaving," Crannon said. "You are. I'm staying right here." Crannon looked at him coldly. "Get in the truck or I'll kill you. No one stays out here. For one thing, you couldn't live an hour. But worse than that, the grubbers would get you. Kill you at once, of course, but that's not important. You have equipment that we can't allow into their hands. You want to see a grubber with a gun?" While the Pyrrhian talked, Jason's thoughts rushed ahead. He hoped that Crannon was as thick of head as he was fast of reflexes. Jason looked at the trees, let his gaze move up through the thick branches. Though Crannon was still talking, he was automatically aware of Jason's attention. When Jason's eyes widened and his gun jumped to his hand, Crannon's own gun appeared, and he turned in the same direction. "There, in the top!" Jason shouted, and fired into a tangle of branches. Crannon fired too. As soon as he did, Jason hurtled himself backwards, curled into a ball, rolling down the incline. The shots covered the sound of his movements, and before Crannon could turn back, gravity had dragged him down the rock and into the thick foliage. Crashing branches slapped at him, but slowed his fall. When he stopped moving, he was lost in the tangle. Crannon's shots came too late to hit him. Lying there, tired and bruised, Jason heard the Pyrrhian curse at him. He stamped around the rock, fired a few shots, but knew better than to enter the tree line. Finally, he gave up and went back to the truck. The motor gunned into life, and the treads clanked and scraped down the rock and back into the jungle. There were muted rumblings and crashes that slowly died away. Then Jason was alone. Up until that instant, he hadn't realized quite how alone he would be. This is it's a scene break, not a new chapter. Surrounded by nothing but death, the truck vanished from sight. He had to force down an overwhelming desire to run after it. What was done was done. This was a long chance to take, but it was the only chance to contact the grubbers. They were savages, but they still had to come from human stock, and they hadn't sunk so low as to have stopped barter with the civilized Pyrians. He had to contact them, befriend them, find out how they had managed to live safely on this madhouse world. If there had been another way to lick the problem, he would have taken it. He didn't relish the role of martyred hero, but Kirk and his deadline had forced his hand. The contact had to be made fast, and this was the only way. There was no way of telling where the savages were or how soon they would arrive. The woods weren't too lethal. If the woods weren't too lethal, he could hide here and pick his time to approach them. If they found him among the supplies, they might skewer him on the spot with typical Purian reflexes. Walking warily, he approached the line of trees. Something moved on a branch, but vanished as he came nearer. None of the plants seemed to be poisonous, so he slipped behind it. There was nothing deadly in sight, and that surprised him. He let his body relax a bit, leaning against the rough bark. Something soft and choking fell over his head. His body was seized in a grip of steel. The more he struggled, the tighter it held him, until the blood thundered in his ears and his lungs screamed for air. Only when he grew limp did the pressure let up. His first panic ebbed a little when he realized it wasn't an animal that attacked him. He knew nothing about the grubbers, but they were human, so he still had a chance. His arms and legs were tied, the power holster ripped from his arm, and he felt strangely naked. The powerful hands grabbed him again, and he was hurled into the air, only to fall face down across something warm and soft. Fear pressed in again. It was a large animal of some kind, and all Pyrean animals are deadly. When the animal moved off, carrying him, the panic was replaced by a mounting feeling of elation. The grubbers had managed to work out a truce of some kind with at least one form of animal life. He had to find out how. If he could get that secret, get that back to the city, it would justify all of his work and pain. It might even justify Welf's death if the age-old war could be slowed or stopped. Jason's tightly bound limbs hurt terribly at first, but grew numb when the circulation shut off. The jolting ride continued endlessly. He had no way of measuring time. And rainfall soaked him, and then he felt his clothes steaming as the sun came out. The ride was finally over. He was pulled from the animal's back and dumped down. His arms and face dropped free as someone loosed the bindings. The circulation slowly returned, and with them the pain. He struggled to move. When his hands finally obeyed, he lifted them to his face and slipped away the covering, a sack of thick fur. Light blinded him as he sucked breath back in, clean air at last. Blinking against the glare, he looked around. He was lying on a floor of crude planking, the setting sun shining into his eyes through the doorless entry to the building. There was a plowed field outside, stretching down the curve of the hill at the edge of the jungle. It was too dark to see much inside the hut. Something blocked the light of the doorway, a tall, animal-like figure. On second look, Jason realized it was a man with long hair and a thick beard. He was dressed in furs, even his legs were tightly wrapped in fur leggings. His eyes were fixed upon the captive, while one hand fondled an axe that hung from his waist. "Who are you? What do you want?" the bearded man asked suddenly. Jason picked his words slowly, wondering if this savage shared the same hair-trigger temper as the city dwellers. "My name is Jason. I come in peace. I want to be your friend." "Lies!" the man grunted, and pulled the axe from his belt. "Junk man tricks. I saw you hide. You wait to kill me. Kill you first." He tested the edge of the blade with a horny thumb, and then raised it. "Wait," Jason said desperately. "You don't understand." The axe swung down. "I'm from off-world and—" A solid thunk shook him as the axe buried itself in the wood next to his head. At the last instant, the man had twitched it aside. He grabbed the front of Jason's clothes and pulled him up until their faces touched. "It's true," he shouted. "You from off-world?" His hand opened, and let Jason drop back before he could answer. The savage jumped over him and dived towards the rear of the hut. "Rez must know of this." He fumbled with something that lit up on the wall. Light sprung out. All Jason could do was stare. The hairy, fur-covered savage was operating a communicator. The calloused, dirt-encrusted fingers deftly snapped open the circuits and dialed a number. Chapter 16. It made no sense. Jason tried to reconcile the modern machine with the barbarian and could not. Who was he calling? The existence of one communicator implied that there was at least one more. Was Rez a person or a thing? With a mental effort, he grabbed hold of his thoughts and braked them to a stop. There was something new here, factors he had not counted on. He kept reassuring himself that there was an explanation for everything once you had your facts straight. Jason closed his eyes, shutting out the glaring rays of the sun where it cut through the treetops, and reconsidered the facts. They separated easily into two classes, those he had observed for himself and those he had learned from the city dwellers. This last class of facts he would hold to see if they fitted with what he learned. There was a good chance that some, or all of them, would prove false. "Get up," said the voice. "We're leaving." His legs were still numb and hardly usable. The bearded man snorted in disgust and hauled him to his feet, propping him against the outer wall. Jason clutched the knobby bark of the logs, and he was left alone. He looked around, soaking up impressions. It was the first time he had been on a farm since he had run away from home. A different world with a different ecology, but the similarity was apparent enough to him. A newly sown field stretched down the hill in front of the shack, plowed by a good farmer, even well-cast furrows that followed the contour of the slope. Another log building, larger, was next to this one, probably a barn. There was a snuffling sound behind him, and Jason turned quickly and froze. His hand called for the missing gun, and his finger trigger was down on a trigger that wasn't there. It had come out of the jungle and padded up quietly behind him. It had 6 thick legs with clawed feet that dug into the ground. The 2-meter-long body was covered with matted yellow and black fur, except the skull and shoulders. Those were covered with overlapping bony plates. Jason could see all this because the beast was that close. Jason waited to die. The mouth opened, a frog-like division of the hairless skull, revealing double rows of jagged teeth. "Here, Fido," the bearded man said, coming up behind Jason, snapping his fingers at the same time. The thing bounded forward, brushed past Jason, who was dazed, and rubbed his head against the man's leg. "Nice doggy," the man said, his fingers scratching under the edge of the carapace where it joined the flesh. The bearded man had brought 2 riding animals out of the barn, saddled and bridled. Jason barely noticed the details of smooth skin and long legs as he swung up onto one. His feet were quickly lashed to the stirrups. When they started, the skull-headed beast followed them. "Nice doggy," Jason said, and for no reason started to laugh. The bearded man turned and scowled at him until he was quiet. By the time they entered the jungle, it was dark. It was impossible to see under the thick foliage, and they had no lights. The animals seemed to know the way. There were scraping noises and shrill calls from the jungle around them, but it didn't bother Jason too much. Perhaps the automatic manner in which the other man undertook the journey reassured him, or the presence of the dog that he felt rather than saw. The trip was a long one, but not immediately uncomfortable. The regular motion of the animal and his fatigue overcame Jason, and he dozed into a fitful sleep, waking with a start each time he slumped forward. In the end, he slept sitting up in the saddle. Hours passed that way, until he opened his eyes and saw a square of light before them. The trip was over. His legs were stiff and galled with saddle sores, and after his feet were untied, getting down was an effort, and he almost fell. A door opened, and Jason went in. It took him several moments for his eyes to get used to the light. until he could make out the form of a man in a bed before him. "Come over here and sit down." The voice was full and strong, accustomed to command. The body was that of an invalid. A blanket covered him to the waist. Above that, the flesh was sickly white, spotted with red nodules, and it hung loosely over his bones. There seemed to be nothing left of the man except skin and skeleton. "Not very nice," the man said, "but I've grown used to it." His tone changed sharply. "Noxa said you're from off-world. Is that true?" Jason nodded yes, and his answer stirred the living skeleton. His head lifted from the pillow, and the red-rimmed eyes sought his with desperate intensity. "My name is Rez, and I'm a grubber. Will you help me?" Jason wondered at the intensity of Rez's question, out of all proportion to the simple content of its meaning. Yet he could see no reason to give anything other than the first and obvious answer that sprang to his lips. "Of course I'll help you, in any way I can, as long as it involves no injury to anyone else. What do you want?" The sick man's head fell back limply, exhausted, as Jason talked, but the fire still burned in his eyes. "Feel assured, I want no injury to others," Rez said. "Quite the opposite. As you see, I'm suffering from a disease that our remedies will not stop. Within a few more days, I will be dead. Now, I have seen the city people using a device that they press over a wound or an animal bite. Do you have one of those machines?" "That sounds like a description of a med kit." Jason touched the button at his waist and dropped a med kit into his hand. "I have mine here. It analyzes and treats most—" "Would you use it on me?" Rez broke in, his voice suddenly urgent. "I'm sorry, I should have realized." He stepped forward and pressed the machine over one of the inflamed areas on Rez's chest. The operation light came on, and a thin shaft of analyzer probe slid down. When he withdrew it, the device hummed. It clicked 3 times as 3 separate hypodermic needles lanced down into the skin. Then the light went out. "Is that all?" Rez asked as he watched Jason stow the med kit back into his belt. Jason nodded, then looked up and noticed the wet marks of tears on the sick man's face. Rez became aware at the same time and brushed at them angrily. "When a man is sick," he growled, "the body and all of its senses become traitor. I don't think I've cried since I was a child, but you must realize it's not for myself that I'm crying. It's the thousands of my people who have died for the lack of that little device you treat so casually." "Surely you have medicines, doctors of your own?" "Herb doctors and witch doctors," Rez said, consigning them all to oblivion with a chop of his hand. "A few hard-working and honest men are hampered by the fact that faith healers can usually do better than their strongest potion." The talking had tired Rez. He stopped suddenly and closed his eyes. On his chest, the inflamed areas were already losing their angry color as the injections took effect. Jason glanced around the room, looking for clues to the mystery of these people. Floor and walls were made of wood, lengths fitted together, free of paint or decoration. They looked simple and crude, fit only for savages that he had expected to meet. Or were they crude? The wood had a sweeping, flame-like grain. When he bent close, he saw that wax had been rubbed over the wood to bring out the pattern. Was this the act of savages, or of an artistic man seeking the most of simple materials? The final effect was far superior to the drab paint and riveted rooms of the city dwellers. Wasn't it true that both ends of the artistic scale were dominated by simplicity? The untutored aborigine made simple expressions of a clear idea and created beauty. At the other extreme, the sophisticated critic rejected the over-elaboration and decoration and sought the truthful clarity of uncluttered art. At which end of the scale was he now looking? These men were savages. He had been told that. They dressed in furs and spoke a slurred and broken language. At least Naxa did. Rez had admitted he preferred faith healers to doctors, but if all this was true, where did the communicator fit into the picture? Or the glowing ceiling that illuminated the room with a soft light? Rez opened his eyes and stared at Jason, as if seeing him for the first time. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" There was a cold menace in his words, and Jason understood why. The city Pyrians hated the grubbers, and without a doubt the feeling was mutual. Naxa's axe had proved that. Naxa had entered silently while they talked, and stood with his fingers touching the heft of the same axe. Jason knew his life was still in jeopardy until he gave an answer that satisfied these men. He couldn't tell the truth. If once they suspected he was spying on them to aid the city people, he would be ended. Nevertheless, he had to be free to talk about survival problems. The answer hit him as soon as the problem had been stated. All this had only taken an instant to consider. As he turned back to the face of the invalid, he answered at once, trying to keep his voice normal and unconcerned. "I'm Jason Denault, an ecologist, so you see I have the best reason in the universe for visiting this planet." "What's an ecologist?" Rez broke in. There was nothing in his voice to indicate whether he meant the question seriously or as a trap. All traces of the ease of the former conversation were gone. His voice had the deadliness of a stingwing's poison. Jason chose his words carefully. Simply stated, it is that branch of biology that considers the relations between organisms and their environment, how climatic and other factors affect the life forms, and how the life forms, in turn, each affect each other and the environment. That was as much as Jason knew. Very little more about the subject, but he quickly moved on. I heard reports of this planet, and finally had to come here for a stand. I did what work I could in the shelter of the city, but it wasn't enough. The people there think I'm crazy, but they finally agreed to let me make this trip out here." "What arrangements have been made for your return?" "None," Jason told him. "They seemed quite sure that I would be killed instantly, and had no hope of me coming back. In fact, they refused to let me go, and I had to break away." The answer seemed to satisfy Rez, and his face cracked into a mirthless smile. "They would think that. Those junk men can't move a meter outside their own walls without an armor-plated machine as big as a barn. What did they tell you about us?" Again, Jason knew a lot depended upon his answer. This time he thought carefully before speaking. "Well, perhaps I'll get that axe in the back of my neck for saying this. I have to be honest. You must know what they think. They told me you were filthy and ignorant savages who smelled, and you practice curious customs with the animals. In exchange for food, they trade you beads and knives." Both of the Pyrians broke into convulsions of laughter at this. Rez stopped soon, from weakness, but Naxa laughed himself into a coughing fit and had to splash water over his head from a gourd. "I believe that well enough," Rez said. "It sounds like the stupidity they'd talk. Those people know nothing of the world they live in. I hope the rest of what you say is true, but even if it is not, you are welcome here. You are from off-world, that I know. No junk man would have lifted a finger to save my life. You're the first off-worlder my people have ever known, and for that you are doubly welcome. We will help you in any way we can. My arm is your arm." His last words had a ritual sound to them, and Jason repeated them. Naxa nodded at the correctness of this. At the same time, Jason felt that they were more than an empty ritual. Interdependence meant survival on Pyrrhus. He knew that these people stood together to the death against mortal dangers all around him. He hoped that the ritual would include him in that protective spear. "That's enough for tonight," Rez said. "The spotted sickness has weakened me, and your medicine has turned me to jelly. You will stay here, Jason. There's a blanket, but no bed, at least for now." Enthusiasm had carried Jason this far, making him forget the 2G exertions of the long day. Now fatigue hit him like a physical blow. He had dim memories of refusing food and rolling into the blanket on the floor. After that, oblivion. Chapter 17. I'm going to stop here, and we'll start again tomorrow on Chapter 17.